Welcome. Today, we're really digging into something fundamental: energy, how we got here, how we power everything. And we're using a fantastic guide, Richard Rhodes' big book, Energy, A Human History. Think of it as a massive shortcut to understanding today's energy mess.
That's a great way to put it. Because Rhodes shows us, these huge climate challenges we're facing now. They aren't new in kind. They're the echoes, the legacies of energy shifts we've gone through before. We've done this before: wood to coal, coal to oil.
And it's not just dry history, is it? It's full of these amazing characters, incredible ingenuity, often sparked by, running out of stuff or choking on pollution.
Exactly. And Rhodes' whole point, really, is to shed light on the choices we have now regarding climate change. But he does it by looking back at centuries of actual human experience, not just, the latest technical debates or political shouting matches.
It gives you perspective, deep perspective.
It really does.
Okay, so let's dive in. Where does Rhodes start this whole massive story?
Well, he takes us back to Elizabethan England, 16th century. Right around London, things are getting tight.
Tight? What was the pressure?
Population, basically, going fast between about 1570 and 1600. And wood, which was, everything back then, fuel, buildings, tools, suddenly wasn't infinite anymore. It was getting seriously scarce, especially around the big city.
And Rhodes gives this amazing, almost unbelievable example to show how bad it was, involving Shakespeare.
Yeah, William Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Not as the playwright we know, but as a businessman, a part owner of the theater, London's first big playhouse.
Okay.
So their lease runs out in 1598. The landowner wants the land back.
Yeah.
But Shakespeare and his partners, they need the wood. The actual timber beams of the theater building are incredibly valuable by this point.
So what do?
Well, Rhodes describes how they waited till the landowner was out of town for Christmas. Then they just dismantled the entire building, took it apart beam by beam.
No way.
Yes. And they hauled all this precious timber across the frozen River Thames to build the new Globe Theater on the other side. The landowner actually sued them later, basically saying the Globe was built with stolen wood.
Wow. That says everything about how desperate things were for timber.
It really does. Risking lawsuits, maybe even fights, just for the lumber from one building. But it wasn't just theaters competing for wood. The really big consumer, the one driving national policy, was the Royal Navy.
Ah, right. Building those massive warships. Nelson's Navy didn't run on coal.
Exactly. It ran on oak, lots of oak. Rhodes quotes a figure: an average ship of the line needed something like 2,500 big oak trees.
2,500.
And these weren't just any trees. They needed huge straight mass trees that took, 80 to 120 years to grow? And it gets worse. They also needed these specific curved timber, compass timbers they call them. Big bent oaks for the ship's ribs and keel, naturally grown curves.
Hard to find, I bet.
Increasingly so. Because of something called the enclosure movement, landowners fencing off common land, cutting down hedgerows and scattered trees to make bigger fields, mostly for sheep, a lot of those naturally curved trees just disappeared.
So you've got shipbuilding competing with, basic construction and also with farming.
Precisely. Timber versus grain for land use. Rhodes even quotes this official, Thomas Preston, who argued that cutting down oak trees was actually a good thing, a sign of national improvement.
How could he argue that?
Because farmland, he said, was 1,000 times more valuable than any timber can ever be. The whole economic calculation was shifting. Trees went from being this essential resource to being, an obstacle to more profitable farming.
A classic resource conflict. When that happens, you need an alternative.
And the obvious alternative, the one sitting right there under the ground, was coal.
But people didn't just switch overnight, did they? Rhodes talks about this real resistance to coal.
Oh, absolutely. Coal had a terrible reputation. It wasn't just seen as dirty. It was considered genuinely toxic, diabolic, some called it. Poisonous when burnt in dwellings.
Diabolic.
Some preachers apparently called it the devil's very excrement. There's this deep-seated Elizabethan prejudice against it. And maybe a bit of that older, almost pagan idea, like people rifling the bowels of their Mother Earth. Digging stuff up felt wrong somehow.
But the wood ran out. Necessity trumped the prejudice.
Completely. The numbers Rhodes gives are just wild. Between 1591 and 1700, coal shipments into London went up 10 times, from maybe 35,000 tons a year to nearly 500,000 tons.
That much coal burning in one city, that must have created a whole new kind of problem.
You bet it did. Air pollution on a scale nobody had ever seen before. Which brings us to John Evelyn.
Right, the famous diarist and scientist, founder of the Royal Society.
That's him. And he wrote this furious pamphlet in 1659 called Fuma Fugium, basically driving away smoke.
What did he say? Was it just complaining?
Oh, it was way beyond complaining. Rhodes uses Evelyn's descriptions, and they're horrifying. He calls London a resemblance of hell, choked by this thick sea coal smoke. He said life itself was being degraded. He talks about being in church, a big church, and the smoke inside was so thick he couldn't actually see the minister at the front.
Inside the church.
Inside. And he couldn't hear the sermon either because everyone was coughing so much. The people's barking, he called it. It wasn't just unpleasant, it was stopping basic daily life.
Sounds like a modern smog crisis. But back in the 1600s, did Evelyn have any ideas about what to do?
He did, and it was pretty radical for the time. He pointed the finger not just at homes burning coal, but at the big industrial user, the brewers, the dyers, the soap makers.
The factories of the day.
Sort of, yeah. And his big idea, which he pitched to King Charles II, was basically urban planning by decree. Force all those polluting trades to move way downriver, 5 or 6 miles outside the city, past the Isle of Dogs. He hoped the river bends would keep the smoke away.
Wow. So even then, they were thinking about zoning and relocating industry to deal with pollution. Didn't happen, I assume.
No, not really. Too complex, too expensive. But it shows the awareness was there. Pollution wasn't invented in the 20th century. It arrived with the first wave of heavy industry. And the need for coal just kept growing, which meant digging deeper.
Which leads to the next big hurdle, water.
Exactly. As the easy surface coal ran out, miners had to chase the seams deeper and deeper. Rhodes mentions depths of 800 feet or more.
And what happens when you dig that deep?
You hit the water table. It's inevitable.
Right.
Suddenly, your nice, profitable coal mine is filling up with water. And if you can't pump it out fast enough, you have to abandon the mine. Keeping mines dry became, as Rhodes puts it, the great engineering problem of the age.
A bottleneck for the whole economy, really.
Totally. And digging deeper wasn't just wet, it was dangerous in other ways, too. Gases. Mine damps, they call them.
Rhodes makes a distinction, right? 2 main types.
Yeah, he clarifies that. There's fire damp, which we now know is methane, highly explosive. Boom. Choke damp. That's mostly carbon dioxide and nitrogen. Doesn't explode, just suffocates you silently. Nasty stuff. The conditions must have been just terrifying.
And Rhodes describes this job. The fireman, it sounds absolutely insane.
It's one of the most harrowing bits in the book.
Yeah.
This poor guy's job. Okay, he has to put on sackcloth soaked in water, lie flat on the mine floor because the methane, the fire damp, tends to collect near the ceiling.
Okay.
Then he takes a long pole with lit candles on the end and crawls into the darkness to deliberately set off any gas that's built up overnight.
He intentionally causes an explosion.
A small, controlled one, yes, to burn off the gas before the main shift of miners came in and accidentally triggered a massive, deadly blast with their lamps, like the one Rhodes mentions at Wales in 1675. Miners literally blown out of the shaft or wrapped around timbers. The fireman was a human sacrifice almost to prevent a bigger catastrophe.
Unbelievable courage or desperation.
But this constant, deadly struggle against water and gas, that's the direct pressure that led to the invention of the steam engine. They had to find a better way to pump out that water.
And the breakthrough didn't come from Britain initially.
Well, the first key insight came from a Frenchman, Denis Papin. Interestingly, Rhodes notes Papin was actually more concerned with, feeding poor people. He invented the pressure cooker. Papin realized that when steam cools and condenses, it creates a vacuum. A really powerful vacuum, much better than gunpowder explosions. He figured out how to use both steam pressure pushing up and the vacuum pulling up to lift water. He got water up 70 feet, way past the 33-foot limit of just using atmospheric pressure.
So he had the physics, the principle, but not the practical machine for the mines.
Right. That came from an Englishman, Thomas Newcomen. His engines were huge, clunky, incredibly inefficient by later standards, but they worked. They were stationary engines designed specifically to pump water out of mine shafts.
And his big improvement came by accident.
That's the amazing part, Rhodes highlights. It wasn't brilliant design, it was a mistake. A leaky part.
Wait, really? The thing that basically kicks off the Industrial Revolution was a faulty component?
According to Rhodes, yes.
Mm.
On one of Newcomen's engines, a brass cylinder had a badly soldered joint. It was supposed to be cooled slowly from the outside by a water jacket to make the steam condense. But the joint failed, and cold water sprayed into the cylinder.
Uh-huh.
And instantly, poof, the steam inside collapsed, creating a much faster, much stronger vacuum than the slow external cooling ever could. That accidental discovery of injecting cold water directly into the cylinder made the engine suddenly much more powerful and practical.
That's incredible. Progress through random failure. But the Newcomen engine was still just for pumping, right? Still just up and down.
Very inefficient, burned tons of coal, and stuck at the mine head. To really change the world, you needed the next step. James Watt.
The famous James Watt, working at Glasgow University.
Watt dramatically improved the efficiency, mainly by adding a separate condenser so the main cylinder could stay hot. But the key partnership, Rhodes emphasizes, was with Matthew Boulton. Boulton was the businessman, the visionary, with scale in mind.
Is that the famous quote about making it for the world?
That's the one. Watt apparently offered Boulton the rights just for a few English counties, and Boulton supposedly said something like, "I don't want to make this for just 3 counties. I find it very well worthwhile to make for all the world." He saw the potential.
And their really big innovation, the one that, as Rhodes puts it, changes everything.
Rotary motion, their double-acting steam engine around 1781.
Why was that so important? It seems simple, making something go in a circle instead of up and down.
Think about it. Before that, what could a steam engine do? It could pump water, lift things vertically. As Rhodes says, its only trick was drawing a straight line, a very specialized tool.
Okay.
But rotary motion. Suddenly, that engine could turn a wheel. It could drive belts and shafts. It could power machines, looms, spindles, grinders.
So it wasn't just for mines anymore.
Exactly. Now, you could put a steam engine anywhere, not just by a river for water power, and use it to run a factory full of machines. Rhodes has this great line. The steam giant learned how to describe a circle, and that seemingly simple step allowed factories to cluster near coal fields, near cities, near labor. It completely reshaped the map of industry and where people lived.
Okay, so steam power gets the machines running, but people still needed to see, especially if factories are going to run longer hours. What about light? It was still pretty dark back then, wasn't it?
Incredibly dark. Rhodes mentions the Lunar Society, this group of top Enlightenment thinkers in Britain. Boulton and Watt were members, Erasmus Darwin too. Why were they called the Lunar Society?
Because they met by the light of the moon.
Exactly. They scheduled their meetings for the nights of the full moon because the road outside the cities were so pitch black, they literally needed moonlight to travel safely to each other's houses. That tells you how scarce artificial light was, even for the elite.
So what were the options before electricity? Rushlights? Candles?
Yeah, rushlights were the cheap option, basically reeds dipped in grease. Rhodes mentions a poor person could get maybe 800 hours of dim light for just 3 shillings. But for bright, high-quality light for centuries, the gold standard was whale oil,
From whaling ships.
specifically spermaceti oil. It came from a special cavity in the head of the sperm whale. Rhodes says it gave the clearest and most beautiful flame. It was the premium lighting fuel.
And valuable enough to be political.
Oh, definitely. Rhodes digs into this fascinating episode after the American Revolution. The U.S. economy, especially New England's, depended heavily on whaling and exporting that spermaceti oil. John Adams, when he was the U.S. Minister to Britain, actually went and lobbied the British Prime Minister, William Pitt.
What was his argument? Buy our oil or else.
Kind of, but his angle was clever. He basically told Pitt, look, London needs good street lighting to prevent crime, robberies, murders. Our American spermaceti provides the best light. So buying our oil is actually good for British law and order.
That's a good pitch. Did it work?
Not immediately. The British dragged their feet on a trade deal. So the American whalers, led by this determined Nantucket guy, William Roch, took matters into their own hands.
What did Roch do?
He basically threatened to move his entire whaling operation, the ships, the expert crews, everything to France. Rhodes quotes him telling the British negotiators something like, "If you don't want our skills, I will give France some of the best blood of the island of Nantucket."
Wow, he meant his whalers, the skilled labor.
Exactly. He was talking about exporting American expertise, the human capital. And France was apparently very interested. It shows how crucial these energy resources, even whale oil, were tied up with national power and skills.
But whaling couldn't last forever. What started to compete with it?
Gaslight. Coal gas, specifically, pioneered by William Murdoch, who actually worked for Boulton and Watt. They saw the potential early.
Making gas from coal. How did they sell that idea?
Well, Rhodes mentions this French inventor, Philippe Le Bon, who had a similar idea, and Le Bon's marketing pitch was amazing. He talked about his invention like it was a magical servant. He described this ethereal substance that could travel silently in a tiny pipe, cook your dinner, heat your bath, light your room, all instantly obeying your commands. It sounds just like, modern ads for natural gas or electricity. The dream of convenient, on-demand energy.
But Gaslight had a downside too, didn't it? Rhodes connects it to working conditions.
A huge downside. Gaslight was much brighter and cheaper than whale oil lamps, which was great, except factory owners realized it meant they could keep the machines running all night.
Longer hours.
Rhodes points to a mill owned by Phillips and Lee in 1805 as an early adopter. Suddenly, night shifts became common. He quotes a pamphlet from striking workers who described the conditions as being like third world sweatshops.
So this technological marvel, Gaslight, directly enabled harsher exploitation of workers.
That's a recurring theme Rhodes pulls out. Innovations often had these double edges. Light conquered darkness, but it also enabled round-the-clock industrial labor. But even Gaslight eventually faced a new competitor, the one that really killed off whaling, petroleum, rock oil.
Where did that come from initially? Not Drake's well yet.
No, before Drake. Rhodes credits Abraham Gesner, a Canadian geologist, in the 1840s and 50s. Gesner figured out how to distill a usable lamp fuel from bitumen and a type of coal called cannel coal, basically oil shale. He called it kerosene, from the Greek word for wax, keros.
So kerosene existed before crude oil wells.
Distilled from shale and coal, and it was becoming pretty popular. Rhodes says production hit 1.5 million gallons a year by 1859. But the real game changer was understanding crude oil itself.
And that required a chemist.
Benjamin Silliman Jr., a professor at Yale.
Yeah.
He got a sample of this weird rock oil that was seeping out of the ground along Oil Creek, Pennsylvania, and he did the crucial scientific work.
Which was?
Fractional distillation, basically realizing that crude oil isn't one thing. It's a mixture of different liquids, different hydrocarbons. And if you heat it carefully, these different parts boil off at different temperatures.
You're like separating alcohol from water.
Exactly. Silliman painstakingly heated the crude and collected the vapors at different temperature ranges. Rhodes says it took him weeks. He identified 7 distinct components, including the one perfect for lamps kerosene, but also lubricants, lighter fluids. He saw the huge potential.
And his report basically gave the green light for our investment.
It did. It convinced the investors to back Edwin Drake, who famously drilled the first successful oil well near Oil Creek in 1859. And that just unleashed chaos, the Pennsylvania oil boom.
Why chaos?
Because nobody knew who owned the oil underground. The existing laws were based on things like water or even wild animals.
How does that apply to oil?
The principle was rule of capture. If a fox runs onto your land, you don't own it until you catch it. If it runs onto your neighbor's land and he catches it, it's his fox. They applied the same logic to oil. If you drilled a well and pumped the oil out, it was yours. Oh, the classic tragedy of the commons. Everyone with land nearby had a massive incentive to drill wells as fast as possible and pump like crazy. Because if you didn't get the oil from under your land, the guy next door would just suck it out from under you.
A frantic race to drain the reservoir.
Total frenzy.
Yeah.
And the environmental consequences were immediate and disastrous. The refineries that popped up everywhere, they mainly wanted the kerosene for lamps. The lighter, more volatile stuff like gasoline they had no use for yet.
So they just dumped it.
Dumped it straight into the creeks and rivers. Rhodes paints this picture of waterways running iridescent, shimmering with waste oil, or sometimes just bursting into flames. The pollution problem shifted again, from coal smoke to flammable liquid waste.
It's amazing how each energy source solves one problem but creates another. Okay, so we've got steam power, we've got oil lamps and gaslight. But before cars take over, Rhodes reminds us about another massive energy source, one we barely think about: the horse.
Yeah, it's easy to forget. But turn-of-the-century cities ran on horsepower. Literally. Rhodes uses Manhattan in 1900 as an example. 130,000 horses living and working just on that one island.
130,000. That's a lot of horses. What did they need?
They needed food, obviously. Acres and acres of farmland to grow hay and oats. Rhodes estimates about 4 acres per working horse per year. Think of the logistics, growing it, baling it, shipping it all into the city.
And the output, the waste.
Each one produced, 30 to 50 pounds of manure every single day.
Okay, do the math.
Rhodes calculates it at about 4 million pounds of manure dropped onto the streets of New York City daily. Created this awful, deep mire, especially when it rained.
Sounds pretty grim. Was the manure useful at least? Fertilizer?
It was for a while. Farmers would collect it, but then globalization strikes again. Rhodes explains how explorers, particularly Alexander von Humboldt, found these massive deposits of grano, basically fossilized bird droppings, islands off Peru.
Bird droppings.
Incredibly potent fertilizer, packed with nitrogen and phosphorus. It started hitting the European market around 1840, and it was cheaper and richer than horse manure.
So suddenly, the mountain of city manure wasn't valuable anymore.
Exactly. It flipped from being a resource farmers would pay for to being a massive, expensive waste disposal problem cities had to pay to get rid of. The horse-powered city was literally drowning in its own waste. It created a huge incentive for, something cleaner.
Like electric trolleys or cars.
Precisely. But electricity had its own long journey. Rhodes touches on the early days Ben Franklin's famous kite experiment, sure, but also his slightly weird electrified picnic, where he apparently killed and roasted a turkey using electricity.
Oh, okay, that's different.
And Sir Humphrey Davy demonstrating a powerful arc light way back in 1809. The problem wasn't making electricity. It was that Davy needed a whole basement full of batteries to power his light for a few minutes. And crucially, how do you send the power anywhere?
Right, the transmission problem. Edison's system, direct current DC, didn't travel far.
Nope. Voltage dropped off really quickly over distance. You needed power stations practically on every block. Rhodes uses the example of Niagara Falls, this immense source of power, 6 million horsepower, just sitting there. But they couldn't get that power the 20 miles to the factories in Buffalo efficiently. DC just couldn't handle it. Power was still fundamentally local, just like steam engines or water wheels. Until George Westinghouse and his brilliant engineer, William Stanley Jr., championed alternating current, AC.
The famous War of the Currents with Edison. What was the key advantage of AC?
Transformers. Stanley's big breakthrough was figuring out how to wire them in parallel. Think of it like water pressure. With DC, sending power far was like trying to push water through a narrow hose for miles. You lose all the pressure.
Okay.
AC with transformers allowed them to radically increase the voltage, the pressure for long-distance transmission using relatively thin wires. Then, near the customer, another transformer steps the voltage down to safe, usable levels for homes or factories.
So it's like a pressure booster and then a pressure reducer?
Exactly. That ability to efficiently change the voltage up and down, it completely untethered electricity generation from electricity use. You could build a huge power plant like Niagara and send the power hundreds of miles away. It solved that fundamental locality problem that had constrained energy use for centuries.
A massive leap. But at the same time, the internal combustion engine, ICE, was coming along, challenging electric cars and those crazy Stanley steamers. What was the ICE's big technical problem?
Engine knock. Rhodes explains this really well. Early gasoline, they called it white gas, was pretty crude. Low octane, maybe around 50. Low octane fuel tends to explode prematurely under pressure instead of burning smoothly. So if engineers tried to build engines with higher compression, which makes them more powerful and efficient, the fuel would just bang and clatter, damaging the engine. That was the knock.
So they needed better fuel or an additive.
Exactly. And this is where Charles Kettering and Thomas Midgley Jr. at General Motors come in. They systematically searched for something to add to gasoline to stop the knock. And they found something that worked incredibly well. Tetraethyl lead.
Ah, leaded gasoline. But Rhodes points out they knew about other options, right? Non-toxic ones.
That's the crucial and maybe tragic part of the story. They knew that alcohol ethanol worked really well too. Benzene also worked. But lead had one key advantage over alcohol. You could patent it.
It was about profit.
Kettering wrote a memo to Midgley, which Rhodes quotes, basically saying they needed a solution they could control and profit from. Midgley estimated they could make 3 cents profit on maybe 20% of all gasoline sold if they controlled the anti-knock additive.
Wow.
So GM made a deliberate choice. Instead of pushing for alcohol blends, which would have been cleaner and renewable, they chose lead. And they used the higher performance it allowed not to make smaller, more efficient cars, but to build bigger, heavier, more powerful cars, conspicuous consumption, as Rhodes calls it.
And that decision locked us into decades of lead pollution.
It did. It cemented gasoline's dominance, tailored the entire automotive industry towards larger engines, and put millions of tons of neurotoxic lead into the atmosphere, all driven by that initial choice, prioritizing a patentable additive over a cleaner, readily available alternative like ethanol. It's a stark reminder of how technological paths get chosen and the long-term consequences.
So as we get into the 20th century, the fight against pollution continues, but the type of pollution changes again. It wasn't just the thick black smoke of, say, Pittsburgh anymore.
Right. George Westinghouse, the AC guy, was also an innovator in natural gas. He figured out how to build high-pressure pipelines to bring gas from wells into the city, and then use clever pipe designs, wider pipes in stages, to lower the pressure safely for homes and factories. Kind of like a transformer for gas pressure.
So cleaner natural gas replaced some of the dirty coal.
It did, for a while. It made a difference in places like Pittsburgh. But the underlying industrial pollution risk didn't vanish. You had events like the Denora smog disaster in Pennsylvania in 1948. A weather inversion trapped industrial fumes from steel mills. Zinc works close to the ground for days. This toxic fog killed 20 people outright and made thousands, about 6,000 people, seriously ill. Even after investigators linked the deaths to the mix of pollutants, the superintendent of the local mills just kept them running and publicly denied any responsibility, claiming the mills had nothing to do with the trouble. That denial, that disconnect was still there.
But the next big air pollution crisis was different, wasn't it? Los Angeles smog. It wasn't black smoke.
No, it was this weird, eye-stinging, brownish haze. And the air in LA was actually cleaner in terms of soot and sulfur than old Pittsburgh had been. It was baffling what was causing it.
And the guy who figured it out wasn't even an air pollution expert.
Right. Harry Huggins-Smith. Rhodes tells his story. He was a Dutch chemist at Caltech who specialized in, of all things, the chemical essences of plants, like what makes a pineapple smell like a pineapple.
How did he tackle smog?
He basically had to repurpose his lab, get rid of the pineapple smells. Then he built these contraptions to suck in huge volumes of LA air, condense the pollutants, and analyze the resulting goo.
And what did he find?
Something totally unexpected. He found the smog wasn't just one pollutant. It was a binary poison gas, as Rhodes calls it. It was being created in the air itself. Unburned hydrocarbons from car exhaust and oil refineries were reacting with nitrogen oxides, also from combustion, in the presence of strong sunlight. The sunlight was the catalyst, cooking these two seemingly separate pollutants together into ozone and other nasty irritants.
So the sun itself was turning exhaust into poison.
Essentially, yes, a photochemical reaction. That discovery was huge because it identified the real culprits, cars and refineries, and showed that pollution could be complex, secondary reactions, not just stuff coming straight out of a smokestack. It led directly to things like catalytic converters and modern air quality regulations.
This constant battle with the byproducts of energy use, it brings us to maybe the most controversial modern source, nuclear power. Where did that story start?
Technologically, it starts with Enrico Fermi and his team in Chicago in 1942, building the first controlled nuclear reactor, CP1.
Under the football stadium stands, right?
That's the famous story. The physics challenge Fermi solved was how to get a chain reaction going using natural uranium. Natural uranium is mostly U-238, which doesn't fission easily, and only a tiny fraction, like 7%, is the fissile U-235 isotope.
So how did he make it work? You need the U-235.
He used graphite blocks as a moderator. The neutrons released by fission are initially moving too fast. The U-238 tends to just absorb them. But bouncing them off the carbon atoms in the graphite slowed them down, moderated them just enough so they were more likely to find and split another U-235 atom, keeping the chain reaction going. Brilliant physics.
And the first commercial use wasn't for weapons, but for electricity.
Right. The Shippingport Atomic Power Station in Pennsylvania, which came online in 1957, driven largely by Admiral Hyman Rickover of the Navy's nuclear submarine program. But Rhodes points out something fascinating about why the local utility, Duquesne Light, agreed to host it.
What was their motivation?
Primarily pollution control. Seriously. They saw this experimental nuclear plant as a way to avoid building another coal-fired power plant, which, even back then, would have needed expensive equipment scrubbers to deal with sulfur emissions and smoke.
So nuclear power was initially seen as the clean alternative to coal.
Explicitly so, in that context. It was framed as an environmental benefit, a way to get electricity without the smog. Kind of ironic, given the later politics.
Yeah, because the fear of radiation quickly became dominant. Rhodes talks about the LNT model.
The linear no-threshold model. This is really important. LNT is the assumption, adopted as regulatory policy, that any dose of radiation, no matter how incredibly small, carries some risk of harm, and the risk increases linearly with the dose. No safe threshold.
And Rhodes suggests this wasn't purely science-driven.
He delves into the history and points to evidence that the adoption was influenced by other factors. He specifically mentions the geneticist Hermann Muller, a Nobel winner who strongly advocated for LNT.
What was Muller's angle?
According to Rhodes sources, Muller actually suppressed conflicting data from a colleague. Rhodes mentioned Stern finding effects at low doses, but Muller emphasized the lack of a threshold and apparently downplayed Stern's findings when they didn't fit his narrative against any radiation increase, despite nuances. Muller seemed politically motivated, wanting to use the fear of any radiation to discourage nuclear weapons testing and proliferation. So a model designed for policy and political ends, potentially overriding some scientific nuance, became the bedrock of radiation safety regulation.
And that fear has obviously been a huge factor in limiting nuclear power since.
Absolutely. Despite its actual safety record, Rhodes quotes studies estimating that the use of nuclear power globally has prevented something like 1.84 million deaths that would have occurred from air pollution if that power had come from fossil fuels instead, and avoided emitting around 64 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. And in terms of just running, it's incredibly reliable. U.S. nuclear plants have a capacity factor, the percentage of time they're actually producing power, of over 92%.
Okay, let's compare that to renewables. Wind and solar have obviously grown hugely. Rhodes touches on their history too.
Briefly, he mentions early pioneers like the Jacobs brothers in the 1920s selling small wind turbines, 1 to 3 kilowatts, mainly to farms in rural America before the electric grid reached them.
And solar.
That had to wait longer for the key invention. The silicon photovoltaic, PV cell, developed at Bell Labs in the 1950s.
But the big challenge for wind and solar today isn't making them, it's when they don't make power.
Exactly. Intermittency.
Yeah.
The wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine. That's reflected in their capacity factors. Rhodes gives figures compare nuclear's 92% to maybe 35% for wind and around 27% for utility-scale solar.
So roughly 2/3 of the time, wind and solar farms aren't generating at their peak capacity or at all. What does that mean for the grid?
It means you absolutely need backup power that can ramp up and down quickly to fill the gaps when the renewables aren't available. And right now, that backup is overwhelmingly natural gas power plants.
Which is cleaner than coal, but still a fossil fuel.
Still a fossil fuel, and it releases methane, which Rhodes notes is a very potent greenhouse gas in the short term, like 84 times more effective than CO2 at trapping heat over 20 years. So managing that intermittency, finding long-duration storage or other backup solutions is the massive technical hurdle for a fully renewable grid.
And finally, Rhodes talks about the pace of these transitions. They don't happen overnight.
No, definitely not. He brings in this model by Cesare Marchetti, an Italian physicist who studied how new technologies spread. Marchetti found that adopting major new energy sources takes a really long time, often 50, 60 years or more, from invention to widespread dominance. Because it's not just about the invention itself. Society is like a learning system, Marchetti argued. It works by diffusion, like an epidemic spreading. The initial technology is always crude, expensive, maybe unreliable. You need decades to build up the supply chains, the infrastructure, the skilled workforce, the consumer acceptance.
Like the example Rhodes uses.
The Ford Model T, great invention in 1908. But it's pretty useless until you also had gas stations everywhere, oil refineries churning out gasoline, pipelines to move it, paved roads to drive on. None of that existed instantly. It took generations to build the whole ecosystem around the car. The history just keeps showing us. Energy transitions are slow, complex, and deeply woven into the fabric of society.
So looking back through Rhodes' history, this whole epic journey from wood scarcity in Shakespeare's time to managing solar intermittency today, what's the big takeaway? It feels like this constant cycle.
It really does. Scarcity or pollution creates a crisis. Human ingenuity responds with a technical fix. That fix solves the immediate problem, but often creates a new, different problem, toxic waste, greenhouse gases, whatever, which then requires more innovation. And crucially, these transitions always take far longer than people expect. They take generations.
Which feels like vital perspective for today's climate debate. We need solutions, but history suggests there's no instant fix, no magic bullet.
Exactly. And if you accept Rhodes' historical view and look at the sheer scale of the challenge getting maybe 10 billion people to a decent standard of living without wrecking the climate, the conclusion seems unavoidable. We probably need all the carbon-free tools we have, meaning nuclear, hydro, geothermal, wind and solar, but also likely needing things like natural gas, hopefully with carbon capture, as a bridge. The way these technologies have become so politicized, one party embraces nuclear, the other rejects it, or vice versa, depending on the year, that ideological trench warfare is probably the least likely way to actually solve the problem effectively. History suggests pragmatism, and using everything available is key.
That leads to a final thought. Rhodes brings in the philosopher Elaine Scarry's idea that humans invent technology to kind of make the indifferent physical world care about human pain, to make it knowledgeable about human pain.
Yeah, that's a powerful idea.
So when you look at this whole history, escaping freezing winters without wood, draining deadly mines, cleaning up lethal smog, trying to prevent climate catastrophe, maybe the real goal of all this relentless technological effort isn't just power or profit, but ultimately the protection and flourishing of civilization itself, making the world safer, more livable, less indifferent to our vulnerabilities. And if so, what's the next indifference we need to teach our technology to overcome?
That's a great question to leave folks with. Is it energy storage, waste management, resource equity? The history shows we keep finding new challenges, but also, thankfully, new solutions. It's a messy, ongoing process.
A very human history indeed. Until next time.